So I guess I'll introduce myself a little bit first. My name's Zurita. I've been talking with Dylan for a while. My main kind of focus is in hypnotherapy and Jungian, or not Jungian, just shadow work in general, right? So the psychotherapy and the hypnotherapy part both together. And then I also train very extensively under a very senior Buddhist monastic, which is where all my waking up, all my spiritual experiences happened. Her name was Sister Kante Kema. And then I also have been studying and got trained in growing up by one of my other mentors called Pierre de Souza, and also I'm learning from Stages International, right? So now we've got all of that boring stuff out of the way. So people have an idea of who I am, right? Yeah, Dylan was telling me about this powerful experience of being with a guru. I'm not sure if you want to name him or whatever. And we're not specifically speaking about him, right? But it just came up where I was like, oh yeah, Dylan asked me, have you ever had an experience like that where you meet someone and it's kind of like an intense experience? Um, my answer is yes. My answer was yes, and I just put a little remark around like, oh yeah, but it's not the most fun experience when sometimes that person is trying to, you know, move into something else, right? In other words, there's a low moral development there. So how can someone be so conscious, have all of these states? Actually, to go inside because it's started to rain, ironically, as I started speaking about this subject. You want to believe in synchronicities, you can talk about that. But yeah, people can be very, people can be very spiritually gifted, or they have all these crazy state experiences, but without the necessary moral development. Because no matter how far you go state-wise, you're still in the construct of developmental psychology and the psychology of a human being, which means if you have certain parts of you that aren't fully cleaned up, or you have parts of you that maybe regress into certain ego states that are very young. Ego states as an ego wants, I want this. Like, you know, like how toddlers are, or how like kind of reactionary teenagers can be. They're like, oh no, but I want this. I don't care what my parents says, I want this. Or that's a cookie, that's my cookie. It doesn't matter if someone else is holding it. I'm gonna punch them, I'm gonna bite them, I'm gonna do whatever, but because I want that cookie, because other people aren't experienced as people, right? Now, it's very unlikely that you'll be at this stage when you have a really strong spiritual experience. However, there'll be parts of your psyche or just parts of you in general that will be locked in this stage. So that when you have a shadow cache or when you have a trigger, you go back into them. And one of the biggest triggers for people in general is other people, social interactions, right? So obviously, you know, me and Dylan, we came up in that world where maybe we didn't, you know, I don't want to speak for you, but maybe we didn't have the most confidence around social interactions for whatever reason. You know, we both came from Western cultural societies, him in Australia, me in England, right? Where there's a usual bit of a cultural shadow around expressing yourself fully, right? Although there's strangely, it's like you're allowed to express yourself, but you're also you need to be told what to do. You need to be polite. You need to stay into the society, right? And that got internalized, at least for me, very socially, right? But this is very common. So especially when it's like a bit more of like someone who has a bit more of shadows around something called red stage in spiral dynamics, this can come out around other people where you want to try and control them because you don't feel safe. So in other words, the thing that governs spiritual waking up does not govern at all your moral development. That's a separate thing, right? Which is why there's you have to be careful around just accepting someone because they're a guru or whatever. And this wasn't in response to the person that Dylan met. This is just in general. Like I have a funny story. We have another kind of a crazy, um, how do I explain him? Spiritual guide, spiritual teacher in much more of the bhakti path, which is the path of devotion in Hinduism. Right? I'm not sure if anyone who's listening to this would have heard that. It's basically about giving love to everything and seeing everything as love, right? I'm probably paraphrasing it really badly, but that's the crux of it. And one of my other mentors, not as much, not as much of an intense mentor as someone like Pierre or a sister gamer, but still a mentor nonetheless. His name's Thomas Wing. I'm not sure you've heard of him, Dylan. Um, well, some of my friends were doing a retreat with him, and he brought them to do Shaktipat, which is when you get zapped with energy by a guru, right? But before he went in there on the retreat, he was like, just be careful with this guy because he likes to play around with your energy and pull on you and get you to do certain things that you might not want to do, i.e., donate a large sum of money, right?
Mm.
So that kind of thing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it kind of does. I feel like no, I think it gets a bit more complicated than um it gets a bit complicated because spirituality and morals are somewhat interweaved,
Yep.
but aren't fully interweaved. What I mean
Yeah.
by that
Yeah.
is I
Exactly.
think in order to, for example, transcend I guess the self, you kind of also need to look at your personal psychology. You need to look at your belief systems. You need to look at what's holding you back energetically
Mm,
to expand. And so, um, to expand more, you kind of need to, in a sense, let go of things to shift where you are, and that often involves
yep.
letting go of things that are so moral.
Hmm.
But then there seems to be areas where some people can bypass certain requiring to overcome certain limitations, and they can just go straight into a larger, more awakened state without examining those aspects of personal psychology, which I think
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
very interesting because I feel like for some people that is necessary, but for some gurus, they could misuse power or sex or whatever,
Yeah.
without needing to look into that. And I think find that very fascinating.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Everyone has their different paths, right? So the teacher of my teacher, Bhante Vimalaramsi, he was like, there's three kind of ways to get to enlightenment. There's the insight path, there's the concentration path. This is what a lot of the Hindu mystics go down. Those two. A bit more concentration-y, like being in states, being in samadhi. That was like really popular for a while. Um, to like just be in that kind of state and feel like that's the ultimate state of not suffering, right? And then there's the insight path, which is a little bit different, where states come as a response to that, but it's all about generating the insight into the true nature of reality and the true nature of suffering, right? And then there's the third path, which is the power path, which is basically a little bit like the rock and roll path, right? It's a little bit like the path where it's a bit more random and it's much more dangerous as well, apparently, right? Now, this is also very mystical, very into involved in mysticism, and you can take it for what it is. But if we just want to take it 100% atheistic, 100% psychology based, right? It's still the way of which you're practicing is still more intense and it comes from more of an ego. If you're just practicing to get like magical powers, whether or not they're real or not, but the way that that conditions your mind is a little bit more, there's a little bit more clenching around it because especially if you haven't done the necessary cleaning up work, that gets interpreted as like, oh, I want to do this because I am God or whatever, with classic misinterpretation of the God realization. I am God, I'm superior, right?
Mm.
That kind of thing. Um, so yeah, everyone goes through different stages, and from what you say, I mean, it's quite true, and it's in some ways confronting to look at. In some ways, confronting to look at that. From what I've seen, you don't really need to have any moral prerequisites to become enlightened, right? It helps because it makes your mind more clear and it's just holistic and it's wholesome for the mind. That's what you would say in Theravada Buddhism. It's wholesome for the mind to follow the precepts, which is like the Buddhist version of the Ten Commandments, right? Um, I will not kill or harm living beings on purpose. I won't take what isn't freely given. No sexual misconduct or no wrong sexual activity. No lying, gossip, slander, and harsh speech, and then no drugs and alcohol. They differ from the commandments because it's not what makes you a good or bad person. It's just what you follow these if you want to live a wholesome life and have wholesome things happen to you, right? So it helps in that sense. right? But when it comes to actually developing down the path, it doesn't seem like it's necessary,
At the
right?
same
Which is
time,
kind of an interest.
at the same time, I could
Gone.
I could make an argument that um, certain actions are low vibrational. So as soon as
That's
you
true.
engage in certain low vibrational activity, your energy is dampened. And to be
That's true.
enlightened, you need to sustain a higher vibrational state.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what is happening here? How come some people can, as soon as they get past some sort of perception,
Mm.
perceiving the truth or perceiving the nature of reality, suddenly the rules don't apply? Seems to be almost a
Yeah.
different kind of path to the path of,
Yeah.
hey,
Higher
let's look at
vibration.
vibration, let's change my
Mm.
vibration, let's ascend up the path, up the scale of
Mm.
consciousness until I'm enlightened. Seems like the
Mm.
realization path, looking
It's
and
different.
introspecting,
Yeah.
appears to be a bit different. What are your thoughts on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. That's a great question, actually. A really good question. Um, because if you want to look at the vibration model, which is what it is, it's a model, right? And no matter how complete a model is, it's incomplete because you can't fully map reality for what it is, especially in linguistic minds. So whether you want to move vibration or you want to, use the secret, I can't remember what's that called again? The secret, where
Law
it's
of
like,
attraction.
yeah, law of
Yeah.
attraction, right? Which I'm laughing at it not because I'm laughing at the law of attraction, but I was laughing at the way it was marketed by Oprah, right? So you have that, whatever you want to use it for, right? Or even if it's just like karma, right? Karmic kind of things. It seems like that is a different path to having the final realization or becoming fully realized in or self-transcendent, right? Because if you're going the self-transcendent path, then suddenly your vibration doesn't matter because you're not even interacting with yourself, if that makes sense. You're transcending the self. Vibration is still a part of the self, at least in this model, right? So the reason why it conjoins, but it's also not linked, in my opinion, is because you're going down something where it's just not relevant, right? Now, and then you want to look at the karmic lifetimes and stuff like that. If you want to look at karma, which is something that, is interesting to look at, but you can never really fully understand. And it's also not verifiable either. But if you just want to be philosophical about it, it would almost seem like to raise your vibration increases your karma, right? So if you want to make a realization this lifetime, when it wasn't in the cards for you before, right? Let's say it wasn't in the cards for you, but this lifetime you decided to develop your karma, raise your vibration, then that can help with the realization. However, if you're just coming off of like 10 lifetimes where you lived really well, it's almost like it doesn't really matter. And that you could just be super low moral development, but you just stick to the insight practices. And then suddenly it just comes to fruition, right? That's what it's called as well in the path, coming to fruition, which I think is a good linguistic term for it. Because when you talk about that coming to fruition, it almost it has a really good balance, at least how I internalize it, of something that is personal and impersonal. It's kind of personal because you're still doing something, but it's also coming to fruition because of 10 years ago, right? It's like that old Chinese proverb, which is the best time to have planted a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today, right? It almost like is like that, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I kind of lost you on the last part and
Yeah.
how connected.
So let's say you did plant a tree 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And now your son is taking over because you died, right? That tree is going to come to fruition no matter what, unless you destroy it, right?
Mm.
But it doesn't matter how good of a gardener or how good of a gardener that your son is going to be because you put in the necessary work 20 years ago and let that come to fruition in his lifetime now is going to come to fruition as a tree.
Yeah.
Whereas if you want to put in the graft now, like the vibration, become a good gardener to make sure that that happens, then I think that's when it affects it a little bit more. But this is also one of the things which is something which even the Buddha himself is you can't really know, right? So the
Mm.
story from the suttas, an old story which is very famous, right? Around there's a very talented young boy, and he gets trained by this guru who is morally corrupt. And this guru gets jealous of him and his progress. And he says, okay, for you to attain the final realization, you need to go and you need to kill 1,000 people, right? And the student, being naive and a good student, is like, okay. So he devolves into this animal, basically, this like mass serial killer. He's killed 999 people by this
Mm.
point. And then what happens every morning? The Buddha wakes up, goes into fifth jhana, infinite space, and this surveys the world in compassion to see who he can help bring over to enlightenment. And he notices this guy who's ready for some reason. So he goes to visit him, right? If you want to take the powers literally, which I don't, he goes into the earth, pops up where he is, and just starts walking around. And this guy, I forget his name, the serial killer, goes to, and sees the Buddha. And as he's chasing after him, the Buddha is just out of reach, right? And they're calling each other, calling each other, calling each other. Then eventually he says something and just it snaps this dude out of it, right? I kind of paraphrase the story because I don't remember it fully. But it ends up with this guy becoming one of the Buddha's disciples, and the Buddha says to burn off that karma, you have to walk around and chant this prayer around every woman that's giving birth, so you can make sure that she delivers the baby safely and that she doesn't die, right? And he becomes an arahat doing that. He becomes fully enlightened, right? So whether you want to talk about the moral of that story or whatever, this dude killed 999 people. That's
Mm.
about as low of a vibration as you can get. And obviously there's that element of redemption there around him helping newborns stay alive and their mothers stay alive. But there's still that element of how much can you really shake off of that? And I think that really speaks to what we're talking about now, which is yes, it matters, but no, it doesn't at the same time.
Right. Since these aren't concrete things, it's hard to say what the effect of karma is in these circumstances, right? Would this
Mm,
killing 999 people then affect him in the future, or simply by being enlightened, he is exempt from karma, he's exempt from the rules, he's exempt from
mm,
what came before
mm,
him? Um, I do feel like to say as soon as you hit enlightenment, you're suddenly exempt from karma. That model does feel like a bit of a cop out.
mm,
If we are to assume that karma is a thing that does apply on our
mm,
lives and matters, and enlightenment equals no karma, then yes, that is a very strange proposition.
mm,
Yeah.
mm, mm, mm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's supposed to be you're off the wheel now. You become fully enlightened. You're now off the wheel of samsara, so none of those rules apply to you anymore. Um, in some models at least. But yeah, it's not like the best kind of thing. And also, karma is never fully explained either. It's like known as one of the unexplainable laws by the Buddha, or something like that. So he also said that, yeah, his basic argument was like, I've lived through hundreds of thousands of lifetimes, and in all of those, I still don't know the answers to the questions that you're looking for, right? Which brings us to another interesting topic, which I've been thinking about a lot, and my mentor Pierre, me, have been talking, and also my friend Pierre, we've been talking about, which was the Dharma, or this path to enlightenment, is just a raft. It's to get you from one island to another. But as soon as you're on that island, you don't pick up the raft because it helped you before. You leave it where it is and you continue on your journey, right? So what that means is that to actually attain that last stage, you actually have to let go of the Dharma and let go of its meanings and let go of its teachings. And that's how you tip over into full-on arahatship, apparently. But then if you want to talk about that in more real terms for us, right? It's also, yeah, like these are all amazing systems and constructs, but that's all they are, right? And eventually they also have to be discarded for what comes after, right?
So karma came
Mm.
from Hinduism, and
Yep.
I did hear the argument from a teacher called Dhammarata that the Buddha never actually believed in karma that we know of, but he used
Mm.
karma as an example in the suttas. So he
Mm-hmm.
would tell people um, things related to karma. He'd give stories or analogies related to karma because the people of that time believed in karma. They
Yeah.
believed in
Yeah.
rebirth. they believed in
hmm
these concepts that came from Hinduism. So it
hmm
was
hmm
beneficial to speak to a layperson in a certain way.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
fact, the suttas are split up into um, different audiences. One audience being the monastics, another audience
hmm
being the lay people. So the way
hmm
he would communicate to the lay people is different to the way he would communicate
mm mm
to somebody
hmm
that's further along the path or more intense about it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good example of spiral wizardry. So if you've ever read Spiral Dynamics, they came up with the term spiral wizard, where you're able to see all different stages of where people are at and communicate accordingly, right? Which is a sign of highly developed thinking, right? Talk to someone where they're at. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. If the more you kind of get to know it, the more you kind of realize how atheistic the Buddha actually was. Like my teacher, Sister Kama, always used to say, if there was a university that was open at that time and not a monastic order, Buddhism would be in a science instead. It's just that the monastic order was what was available, right? It was what was available and what was able to continue the teaching through word of mouth or reciting, because they didn't have writing at the start, right? So he just delivered it through that, basically. Um, yeah, he split away. He split away from Hinduism, which so it would make sense that they didn't have karma there. Yeah.
Mm. I think that's a perfect transition into spiral dynamics now. What is spiral dynamics and the 9 stages of ego development and how they linked, how they're
Okay.
different. And
Let's,
I know this is probably a lot to dive into.
well, we can give you. Let's do it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting. Yeah, this will probably be more practical for the people listening as well. Um, so let me just go into whiteboards right now. Just do a new kind of whiteboard. Let me know if you can see this, Dylan.
Yep,
Um,
I can see it.
yep, awesome. So if you want to, so this is what the spiral looks like. It gets bigger and bigger each time it goes up, right? Let's just finish it off there. So this is like a visual representation how the evolution of human consciousness happens, right? You start off here, hunter-gatherer society, and you kind of, and it keeps on going up and it keeps on expanding, right? And each spiral gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it includes, right? So here is what you'd call beige stage. I'm not going to label everything because it'll take too long. And then what's most relevant for people is it goes up to something called yellow, and the colors are irrelevant.
By the way, I just want to give a little background while you're drawing. This is
Mm-hmm.
related to the way that humans and societies develop in maturity. So how
Mm-hmm.
their minds develop over time, how societies change,
Mm-hmm.
and how that relates to how we then interact with the world, how we see the world, how we perceive
Mm-hmm.
the world, and how we learn and interpret information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great summary. And what's important to note in this model, this is all about contents. And what are contents in this situation? They are your values, right? This is about the values of people. So the contents of their mind, not the structure of their mind, the contents of their mind. Structure of your mind is ego development theory, right? Or stages. This is the easiest one to get into, though. So you start off beige stage, which is like hunter-gatherer societies. You're not going to meet many people at this stage, so I'll just kind of gloss over it. And then the next stage is purple stage, right? Purple stage. This is when tribalistic societies start getting formed, right? This is when it's like a circle of elders, basically. And this is when magical thinking starts to really kick off. So when you think about the ancient Greeks or like old Aboriginal tribes or any of these kind of societies, it's like there's a tree, that tree is a god. See how concrete it is? Because it's still in the concrete tier as well, right? So this is when animalistic shamanism comes in, basically, where you have a vision in ayahuasca, and that vision is like, that's what actually happened to you. A dragon actually did come and fly me away to the moon, you know? That really happened because they haven't developed the cognitive ability. It's got nothing to do with intelligence. It's got to do with how they perceive the world. They haven't developed that perception to be able to have more nuance, right? There's the next stage, which we're gonna learn about, which is red stage. This is the stage where start developing boundaries, but this is also all the stage all about power. So when we were talking about gurus or teachers or anything to do with that, right? This is where their ego would crash. Their ego will crash down, and they're more narcissistic, or if they haven't done a lot of the internal work, because this stage especially is oppressed by society because of the stage above it called blue, which we'll talk about later. The red stage is all about individualistic. It's about making. It's pre-rational still, so rationality hasn't developed properly, right? What does that mean? It means that they don't think in long term kind of thinking, right? But what that means is it's like, oh yeah, I'll steal from this guy right now, even though he's my next door neighbor, right? Doesn't make sense to us because we have rationality. But to this person, because they haven't thought about it, that will seem like a really good idea because they think super, super short term. So these are people, this is where antisocial personality disorder and narcissism, this is where they kind of plateau around this phase. Because anything else, if you have full on narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, you find it very hard to conceptualize empathy because you don't have a second person perspective. Second person perspective is there's me and then there's you. If we didn't have a second person perspective right now, we'd just be talking over each other and we wouldn't be able to listen because we would view each other as an object. We haven't developed the ability to see through each other's eyes, which means the conversation and friendship is impossible. Right? So spiritual gurus or anyone hasn't fully gone through and embodied this stage and hasn't healed it and made it really healthy. There's a lot of positive aspects of this. This gives you strength, this gives you power, this gives you the ability to act in the world, the ability to enforce boundaries, the ability to be spontaneous, and it's also very fun as well, right? But if they haven't developed this properly, then this turns into the power and control thing of that story that I was telling you guys about, where it's like, be careful of this guy because he kind of pulls on you, make you do things that you might not want to do, right? And at any point, you can jump in, Dylan, and ask questions. We're going to move on to blue now because this is just obviously a recap or just a little bit of a summary. Blue stage is where a lot of society is right now. Not all of us. In the first world, it's more orange stage, which is the one above this. But blue stage is all about rules, structure, divine right to rule. Right? It's that kind of feeling. This is when monarchy started to really take over in the feudal system. Right? We're not just going to have war bands anymore. We're not just going to have conquerors like Alexander the Great. We're going to have structured rules and legalism and bureaucracy and all of that kind of stuff. So a good example of this is like the Soviet Union. It comes obviously much later, but that is a massive bureaucracy. It's about rules and having this one ideology, and it's very rigid. You see how rigid it is still? It's still in the concrete tier, pretty much. Well, it is in the concrete tier. This is the rules, and you can't question them because the rules are rules, right? It's probably annoying a few people listening to this right now. It's kind of how it is in school, and it's kind of how it is or that is how it is in government bureaucracy, right? It's like, but why are the rules like that? Because those are the rules. And it's like, no, no, but why are they like that? But those are the rules, right? Have you ever, you probably have memories of speaking to someone who kind of acts like that, right? Sometimes it's to be annoying and they kind of know what they're doing, but other times it's just because they can't conceptualize an answer outside of that, right? Because they're at this stage. Now we go on to Australia and England and all of the more developed countries. Orange stage, entrepreneurship develops here. Real freedom of thought, freedom of expression, free speech. Freedom is big here. And this is when something called the strive drive comes up, basically. This is when you start to think about things and want to put them into action in the world externally, right? This is when affirmations and goals and dreams and find your why and all of that kind of stuff. That's when this gets born. Because you're going into the subtle tier now. The subtle tier is when you're more interested in the subtle interpretation of things than what's actually happening around you. So a good example is someone in the concrete tier would be like, oh yeah, we're having a conversation. Or someone in the subtle tier would be more likely to say, well, what is a conversation? What are the rules here? What are the boundaries? What makes a conversation and not just a presentation? Why do we want to have a conversation? You see how these are all more meaning-making questions because they're in something that you can't objectively measure. But anyway, orange stage, freedom, it's very individualistic. It's more material as well because they still have not fully been able to switch off the external world and go inside fully, right? And also this is another stage where because they can think very strategically, that's what makes it different from reds. They think strategically, they think more big picture. However, because it's very individualistic and it's not very communal, that's why it leads to like big companies exploiting certain things because it's all about them. As long as they're making a profit, that's all that matters, right? Is when you then move into something called green stage. Hippies are, right? There's no hierarchy here. They hate hierarchy because hierarchy has been happening all throughout here and it hasn't worked. They're still unhappy. There's still flaws in the world. There's still big oil companies polluting the world or whatever, right? Whatever they are, whatever ideology there is. So now they want a flat hierarchy. Their blind spot is that a flat hierarchy is still a hierarchy. It's just flat, right? The hierarchy where everyone is equal. And then their second blind spot is that they put the hierarchy of no hierarchy above all of the other hierarchies in the hierarchy of hierarchies, right? Bit of a tongue twister. But there's amazing things that happen here. They're all about authenticity, being very honest, being vulnerable. This is when the feminine gets integrated when you're more masculine. This is when the masculine gets integrated when you're more feminine, right? This is all about deep internal exploration. And they love conversations like this. But maybe not what's happening right now, or it's more of a lecture, but deep, authentic, like, hey, Dylan, I feel like you're feeling this, and it makes me feel this way. How does that make you feel? Right? That kind of deep, personal interrelating. However, because it's still below yellow stage, they're still not able to see the whole big picture. So they're still just inhabiting this stage. It means they'll assume that everyone else will also want that, which is not the case, right? And there's a bit of a link here between green stage and red stage. There's nothing like a person who's green stage with red stage shadows. This is like your stereotypical hippie. They're super mean, right? Because they're like all about peace and love and deep authenticity. But because a lot of it's coming from a place of hurt, they regress down to red stage. It's more narcissistic. It's like the narcissistic spirituality, like say in Bali or whatever, right? Because they haven't fully integrated this red stage because they just skipped from blue stage all the way up to green stage, or they skipped red stage altogether and now they're at green and now they're regressing all the time, right? This is like your classic guru who's like always like sexually molesting people or running a cult or this kind of thing because power and control, and because there's no hierarchy, green stage people are really easy to exploit because they're so close. They're really well developed. It's also the shadow sides I'm talking about. Not all green stage people are like this, most aren't. But the ones that are vulnerable, they're so close to seeing the big picture at yellow stage, but they can't quite. So they mistake red. Remember how I said it was pre-rational? They mistake red's pre-rationality for post-rationality, which is what yellow is, right? Because they don't follow strict pure rationality, but one does it because they've never been through it before, and one does it because They've integrated all of the great lessons from it, and now they can do something else, right? And then you get to like yellow stage. This is when you become very systems aware, all about systems and how the external interacts with the internal and how things are constructed in the mind, and it's things super long term, and it's more individualistic as well. So how this graph goes is beige individual, purple communal, red individual, blue communal, orange individual, and it keeps on switching like that. And then yeah, you get to yellow stage, which is you're able to see all of this below and use all of it and communicate it effectively. Over the blind spots at this stage is something which is rife in the community, which is intellectual arrogance. They start thinking this is better than everyone, they're better than everyone else. I've even heard the justification of, oh yeah, like humility is just something you use at the lower stages, you don't use it here. Right. Again, that's when the red stage starts coming up, right? Yeah, basically. Right. So that's the blind spot here, intellectual arrogance. And their other massive blind spot is mistaking the map for the territory. Mistaking this, everything I just told you, for how reality actually is, right? No matter how good the map is, it's never reality, right? And that's a brief overview. So I guess I'll stop the whiteboard now and we can kind of have a chat about that.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really fascinating.
Mm,
So as you go through the stages, and you mentioned you can even skip, or people often skip stages,
mm,
and then they may regress to a previous stage when
mm,
something in their life happens that maybe makes them a bit uncomfortable. They regress to a
mm,
lower
yeah.
stage due to a wounded aspect in themselves. Um, but really, I'm curious about the necessity to go through each stage. And
Mm,
as you go through each stage, and as you have views and belief systems that are um, maybe not so effective or maybe wrong, is that really necessary to go through in order to properly um, be a well-rounded, very integrated person um, up the stages? Or can you, for
mm,
example, say, okay, I'm going to go from, say, red or purple to yellow,
mm,
and I'm going to follow somebody that is really rational and really good at communicating, and I'm just going to learn all their belief systems. I'm just going to
mm,
learn how
mm,
they think, and I'm just
mm,
going to
mm,
learn from them. Is that
mm,
something you can actually do? Or do you have to learn from
mm,
the next idiot and then the idiot after him and then the
mm,
guy that's
mm,
slightly smarter and the slightly smarter?
mm,
You know,
mm, mm, mm.
what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So you can't really skip stages in that way. You can skip like embodying it fully, or you can just have stages that aren't as mature, right? But it's a good question in the sense that you can only really follow someone who is like one level above you, really. The exception to this is when someone is really well integrated and they can see exactly where you are and then they inhabit one stage above you, right? That's the exception there. But let's say we were to take this person who was in red stage, right? And he was like, oh, I want to meet someone who's yellow stage. The reason why he can say that is because there's a part of him, maybe just 10% of his mind, that might actually be open to yellow stage, right? That he's able to make that executive decision. However, the place that it would come from most likely is because he wants to do that so he can dominate and be even more powerful than he already is. Now he's just smarter than all of his competition, right? Um, so in short, no, you can't skip through. However, you can go too fast and be too impatient. Or you can also, if you don't have the right guidance, you can cement certain practices which are not very good for you, i.e., like having certain ego wants that are not the healthy ego wants, but more of the ego wants like that stem from an insecurity and overcompensation. This is where shadow work and hypnotherapy comes in. To be able to go in and see the core seed, really dig it out, And then once you dig it out, it becomes this amazing treasure. I'll give you an example, right? So lately, I was realizing like, so part of my background is I used to be professional, semi-professional Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu player, fighter, whatever you want to call it. That was what I wanted to do. Very kind of hardcore martial arts training, 6 to 8 hours a day, like fighting all the time, competing, getting ready for competitions and having competitors and all that kind of stuff, right? And I quit. I moved away from that. I still do it for fun sometimes, but not really a big thing. And at the gym, I was at the gym, and there's a girl who I go to Latin dancing with. And I said hi. We said hi, we hugged, whatever. She's super friendly. I was like, oh, do you usually come to the gym? And she was like, no, I'm actually coming here for my boyfriend. And I was like, oh, cool, because I didn't know she had a boyfriend. And I'm like, does he train here as well? We were like talking about that. Boyfriend comes over, introduce ourselves. It's a typical kind of a little bit like trying to prove he's the alpha, all that kind of stuff, right? And I was like, but I feel there's this trigger within me to feel like I have to play that game with him a little bit, or that I even think about it, right? Rather
Mm.
than just like not paying attention to it at all. I was like, where does that come from? Well, it comes from, long story short, core seed of having feeling like you had to overcompensate, right? Because of X, Y, and Z that happened in the past. So as soon as I let go of that overcompensation, what happened is there was this amazing, there's what happens is there's a space left over. And from that space where the belief used to be, or that overcompensation used to be, something new can emerge. So that's actually about taking maybe one of your weaknesses or your flaws and allowing it to become one of your greatest strengths, right? Because if you're no longer, in this example, if you're no longer overcompensating, then all that's left is for you to be calm, relaxed, and grounded in an adversarial confrontation, right? Because you also did Muay Thai as well. Muay Thai has a little bit more of a aggressive energy to it, at least when I used to train, because I used to train that as well. So there's a bit more of that animosity there. If you're no longer affected by that, or reactive to that, then suddenly you become much more calm and grounded in those kind of situations. So it's kind of like that, right? I had a little bit of an ego drop down to a little bit of like insecure red stage. That's what it was, insecure red stage. Like feeling like, oh, this is the way that I assert my boundaries or I assert my presence. And then I was allowed to let that drop away. And now a really healthy red stage can emerge from there, which is just being totally cool and fine within yourself and grounded within yourself and knowing that you have those boundaries and letting it express itself that way rather than trying to push and force, right? So that's a
Yeah,
little bit of a tangent, but that gives you a good example, right, of how this stuff can work.
yeah, that's fascinating. And I feel like a lot of guys can relate to this.
Mm,
I think it's something we've all experienced at some stage in our lives.
hmm.
We all meet a guy like that, or even sometimes we're that guy, right? So it
Yeah,
can be the other way
exactly.
around. Um,
Yeah.
and um, what I'm curious about now is moving from um, okay, so we've been speaking in a very rational way of
Yeah.
speaking, a very rational frame, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, there are people that speak from a very intuitive perspective. In
Yep.
fact, a lot of the
Hmm.
spiritual community on YouTube is very intuitive. It might even seem
Hmm.
a bit wishy-washy, but it seems like
Hmm.
people that are into modern spirituality, transcending belief systems, psychic sort of abilities come from a more of a um, more of a I guess more of a magical thinking frame.
Mm.
Now, this can
Mm.
be confusing because, as we talked about before, red stage is often about magical thinking. But it appears
Mm.
like the magical thinking in some of the modern spiritual community, it still might be in red stage, but it seems like there is a way of thinking that is beyond red stage.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So that happens around green stage. Um, More integrated kind of magical thinking, whereas the magical thinking that was at purple and red stage is in the concrete tier. This is in a different model. It's called stages, which we may or may not have time to get into today. We probably won't because it's a massive system. But they break things into tiers. There's the concrete tier, there's the subtle tier, and then there's the meta-aware tier, right? We don't have to worry about the meta-aware tier. We're just talking concrete and subtle, right? So the purple stage and red stage, right? Magical thinking is very concrete. That's a tree. That's a tree god. That's a real tree god, right? And we worship that, right? Whereas when you get into more magical thinking in the subtle realm, right? So green stage, it's more of like, oh, the tree carries its energy. You see how already that's more subtle?
Mm.
You know, it's not necessarily the tree that's important, it's the energy that's inhabiting it, you know, like that kind of stuff. So it's more mystical, mysticism. However, people at this stage, at green stage, they've read a lot about spirituality and they know a lot about it, but they have had a they usually have had a massive lack of actually experiencing it, right? So most of their stuff has kind of been through psychedelics, which is not the same as like a real legit spiritual awakening, as much as they pretend that it might be, right? It can be very helpful. It can open you up. It can be a massive like developmental change. It can be all these amazing things, right? But it's still, you can experience those kind of states sober, and they're more powerful that way because they're more grounded within yourself and it's not an external substance, right? So a psychedelic drug is something that's concrete. You can see it. You can see it, right? Always, always, always be aware of using something concrete to create something subtle, a subtle state, right? Not saying it's bad, not saying you shouldn't do it, but that's what's happening. You're using something concrete to get into something subtle or something even meta-aware, right? Which if you want to have fun and do whatever, please. I'm not adding any kind of judgment here. I'm just saying that's why there's a little bit there's a lot of magical thinking in green stage, which happens again at turquoise stage, but it's much more integrated. I haven't been to this stage yet. I haven't inhabited it, so I don't really know. But everything that I can tell you about that stage is it's much more, it's less dogmatic. There's still a lot of dogma in the new age spirituality, you know, a lot of dogma in that. Where it's like, oh no, this is how it is. If you haven't had this awakening, then you're X, Y, and Z. You know, oh, it's a heart awakening and it has to happen exactly like this, right? And I would actually say that me and you are having a very intuitive conversation. It's quite precise as well because of how we communicate. But this is also another way of being intuitive. You know, we're not putting like up peer-reviewed studies of certain things. We're also discussing ideas and discussing things that are subtle and kind of being like, does this kind of feel right to you? Yeah, that feels like I understand what you mean, right? It's just that sometimes, because what you have to remember is that at this stage, at green stage, they're still playing a character. There's still an identity here. They haven't got through to tier two, which is yellow, which is when they can start to see how everything's constructed and they start to become more, and they start to become more aware of that and they don't play into certain constructs as marks, right? But there's still kind of like a constructed identity at this stage, which is very much like this is my tribe and this is how I think, right? However, at the same time, like if you asked me this question a week ago, I'd have been like, oh yeah, magic is real, all that kind of stuff. However, now I think I'm swinging the other way, which is more atheistic, because there's this thing which my other mentor, I mean, I have so many mentors, I just keep shouting them out. My other mentor called Kim Potter, who's extremely well developed, ego development wise. Him and his sister came up with, you know, the predominant or the most nuanced developmental psychology model available right now, which is Stages International, as well as he's like a very world-renowned psychotherapist, and he just teaches a bunch of crazy stuff in his model, right? He was saying like there's stuff you have to do, reality checks, right? So when someone says that they're astral projecting, he has a 5-digit number on the back of his fridge, which is, by the way, you can't guess a 5-digit number. It's impossible. And he says, oh, you're astral projecting? Cool. I have 5-digit number on the back of my fridge. Can you tell me what it is? Right? So it's bringing the reality checking back into all this kind of stuff, right? And how
Mm.
much of it is just suggestible. and how much of it is um being able to integrate those two. And it's something that I'm putting up to discussion here. I'm not
Yeah.
giving any kind of opinion on it because I'm still kind of conflicted about it too. But there's a whole section in one of his workbooks where it's like doing reality checks, you know, using the scientific model the way that it's supposed to be used, not in the way necessarily it's used now. Like my friend who I'm staying with here has a PhD, he's a doctor in machine learning with AI, right? So a very hardcore degree. He was like, peer-reviewed studies are an absolute joke. Most of the time, they don't even read your paper properly. So it's completely luck if your paper gets published or not, right? So obviously, there's a lot of things with science that are not very good. But what's the actual scientific method? Having a hypothesis and trying to prove it wrong. Whereas when you see all these magical thinking, it's actually the other way around. I feel people are doing. They have a hypothesis and they try and prove it right, right? So I'm not sure what that kind of sparks for you, Dylan, when I say all of that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
I'm getting like a whole bunch of different thoughts, but they're in different
Yeah,
directions. It's like my
yeah,
brain right now is trying to figure out which is the
exactly the
first
same for me.
one to
Yeah,
go
yeah,
down. And it's like, wow.
yeah,
I'll just start by talking about psychic powers. Um,
mm,
since I've had experience meeting mystics and people that
mm,
are able to tell you things about yourself
mm,
without knowing you, without maybe
mm,
even seeing you or seeing a
mm,
situation, and are able to
mm,
provide some insight or even potentially real value there. Um, from my perspective and from what I've observed, that is a very real phenomenon.
mm,
But I think at the same time, it can be also difficult to know
mm,
these powers. Is what I'm detecting accurate, or is it something that is
mm, mm,
imagined or mind created? And because we
mm,
are viewing things as they arise in consciousness, it's difficult to distinguish. Um, is this true or is this not true? And I think that's
mm,
where you kind of dive into that magical thinking, which is um, where you believe something which has no real proof of validity um, for. But I think with like psychic abilities, for example, you it comes from a place because it's just appearing, it's just arising, right? So it comes from a place where you don't necessarily have the validity, or maybe you can't even get the validity because it's not a
mm,
scientific empirical thing that you can measure and check and validate necessarily easily.
mm,
So I think
mm,
that's where a lot of the um maybe confusion or different perspectives, different views kind of lie in channeling or psychic abilities is many channelers they're filtering a lot of the information that's coming in and they're filtering it through their ego, they're filtering it through their psychological development, they're filtering it through their worldview. And so what they
mm,
say
mm,
is it's like they're getting information somehow, some extrasensory perception and some energy, and that's being filtered through a box. The box is their mind, and they get some output.
mm, mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to ask. I think a good rule of thumb is whenever have a real craving for something to be true, you know, you're like, oh wow, I really want that to be true, you know, so
Mm.
that kind of feeling, like, oh wow, have I actually done all of the reality testing on this? Like, give you an example recently. So I love getting the Sakyam tattoos here in Thailand. For those of you that don't know, Sakyam tattoos are like the old kind of tribal tattoos here, which the monks do for you, and they bless you, and they give you all these powers or whatever you want to say. I think they look really cool as well, which is obviously part of the reason I'm doing it. And there's part of me that really believes that, and then there's part of me which is like, oh, this is cool purple stage stuff. I didn't really integrate purple stage. Let me do this cool kind of thing, right? And before I was supposed to have a certain um tattoo. I chose one, but then I had a dream about there's this big monkey head sitting on my lap, And it was just the words Hanuman, Hanuman, Hanuman come to mind. I was like, well, looks like I'm getting a Hanuman tattoo, you know? And I was kind of, so I got that. Looks really good. I think it looks really cool. Really happy with it. No regrets at all. But then I was like, well, I didn't really, if I was to really a reality check on this, was it because that just came to me in my dream? Or was it because I was watching a video game around Sun Wukong, who's inspired by Hanuman for a few days before that, right? And that is another great area because it's like, just because I did that doesn't mean that it didn't come to me in the dream.
Hard to know.
But at the same time, it
Mm.
speaks to your point. How are you supposed to be able to check that? But what it does do is it kind of makes that magical thinking much less concrete and more nuanced, which is all you can really do anyway, right? To add more perspective into it and to be like, oh, okay, this is a good, because remember, we always transcend and integrate. So even if magical thinking is fully nonsense, there's still a perspective in that, which is very useful. But it's also realizing that, hey, maybe I don't want to live my life from this, right? That kind of thing. Maybe I don't want to make decisions from this. Maybe I don't want to just rely on this and give it up to the universe or whatever that is. You know, it works for some people, but for other people, it doesn't work at all, you know?
Mm. Yeah, self-proclaimed Arhat Daniel Ingram has a model in his book on
Yeah.
I guess powers or manifestation and how that actually makes sense, how ma energy, how magic makes sense. He calls it sort of his magical model.
hmm hmm
And um, I may be not accurate when I'm saying this, so bear with me.
hmm
But my understanding from what he kind of said was that everything in this world is magical. So every thought is putting out a certain vibration. It's a magical
hmm
thought. Every belief, it's magical. Action, whatever, it's magical. Um, but just because you think a thought, it's not going to manifest, right? So what does create a manifesting thought into reality? Well, for something to manifest, it requires enough energy. Now, say something like a tattoo, right? How is that any different from thinking about, oh, okay, this is a good luck charm? Well, I would say the difference is you have somebody that has experience in thinking and experience in energy, and they are setting a very strong
hmm
intention that this is going to do something.
hmm
So it's putting more energy into it.
hmm hmm
They have a belief behind it. They have an intention. They're putting time into it as well. So over
hmm
5, 10 hours, they're making this tattoo.
hmm
Now more energy is put into it. Not only that, but if this is a ritualistic thing, whether or not you blindly follow it or not, the fact that for hundreds of generations or tens to hundreds of generations, people have been itching the same tattoo.
hmm
Now
hmm
that is saying people's energy from all these generations have been put into this tattoo. So in reality, it has more meaning.
Yeah.
It has more
Yeah.
of a manifestation. Now I could just put a dot on you, right? I could just take a ballpoint pen, put a dot on you and say, this is my special fighter's tattoo. Now you are going to win all your fights, and now you are going to have very
Mm.
good luck.
Yeah.
I would argue that that would do less than the monk's tattoo. Not because there's
Mm.
anything inherently special about the monk's tattoo, not because
Mm.
anything special because they're Buddhist, because they are monk, whatever. No. The only reason I think that monk's tattoo is more powerful is because they put more time, more thought, more intention, and more generations of people that have believed in something into this. And
Yeah.
because we live in a consensus reality, according to Ingram, that's his model, the consensus reality means there's more people basically that are that have a consensus on a particular thing.
hmm
And
hmm
that would kind of explain why across traditions and spiritual communities, whether it be Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, or even New Age, you have all these ritualistic ceremonies, and people really believe they work. They have a strong
mm,
magical, maybe delusional belief, but then sometimes they actually have some truth into it. Like it's not a complete lie from what I've noticed. Um, there is often some slivers of truth in it. Obviously, this is very hard to validate, um, but the sliver of truth, in my opinion, is not the ritual, because the ritual is completely irrelevant, in my
mm.
opinion. What is the important part? It's the putting energy into something. And the
That's
more
right.
that
Yeah,
you can believe in it, and more you can have that sort of faith, it seems to have some impact according to Ingram.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
wondered if you
yeah.
had any thoughts on that sort of idea.
Yes, there's something interesting that happens as you go through the stages of developmental psychology. I believe it is you get the sixth person perspective, right? Which is a very advanced stage. It's when you start losing track of boundaries, starts becoming boundlessness, internal and external, right? What does that mean in the late term? What it means is you stop being able to, you find it very hard to see the difference between an individual and a collective, i.e. the boundaries in between that, because you see how those boundaries are constructed, right? So it speaks to your point around us being in this kind of communal energy or this collective energy, right? Where something that's happened before is going to, or a whole culture, of course, is going to affect this tattoo and this ritualistic mark. Because if all the boundaries are constructed, which they are, then it means that me getting this tattoo, or you get, let's say, or yeah, me getting this tattoo, there's no drown boundary between me getting this tattoo and everyone else getting this tattoo at the same time, right? So it is that collective kind of like we're all doing this together, you know? And it also means that if it's totally constructed, the boundary between me and you, or the boundary between me and the world, then if you want to speak about energy, right? If you want to speak about energy with that, if there's no boundaries between us, and you can really feel that and go into that and embody that reality, which is what happens in second person perspective, right? Do you get the boundlessness kind of energy? Then then that would actually, I think, support at least my understanding of how you explain Daniel Ingram's model. It's quite interesting and cool, kind of cool to think about, right?
Mm, for sure. I think
Yeah.
for me, what's fascinating is Ingram is a very logical, rational guy,
Yeah, he's super rational.
super rational to the point where
Super rational.
when I read his book, it was very surprising to me because he was able to discuss spiritual views that people talk about online, often in the very magical thinking category, but he was able to
Mm,
create a model around it and create boundaries around certain things and explain certain things.
mm, mm,
Whether
mm.
or not he's right, I'm not sure. But the fact that he was able to do that really blew my mind, because it was like, wow, you can actually put like
Yeah,
a framework on almost anything um, just because you have a certain intuitive sense of the world doesn't mean somebody can't then put a wider perspective on it and then say, oh, this is actually
yeah,
what you're thinking. This is what you're doing. Even if they're not aware of it, Ingram was able to kind of do that.
yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah,
interesting to me because he kind of
yeah.
made a lot of the even more woo-woo out there ideas. He kind of put a model and sort of sense of like scientific boundaries and scientific logical framework around it.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. When I first read his book, it was crazy because the way it's laid out is so satisfying to the mind. Like, oh, you can put this here, you can put this there, then there's this category and there's that category, you know. It's been a while since I wrote it, but maybe I'll read it again. It's back in England actually, so I have to go get it. Um, yeah, yeah. Been a while since I read this stuff.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. Any more questions arising for you?
To
Or
be
is there
honest, I'm
anything
really
that,
tired right now. You can probably tell.
yeah, yeah, that's okay. But we
Yeah.
can always do like a part two as well, you know? Um,
Yeah, I'd love to do a
yeah,
part two when I'm more refreshed.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk
So do you have
about
any,
next time let's talk about the 9 stages of ego development because we talked about spiral dynamics, but what
oh,
I
we
was
can talk
really
about
curious
structure.
about is how that actually interlinks with their 9 stages because they
Yeah,
feel related, but they also feel like sort of different.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
spiral seems to be more focused on how societies
How
think,
societies form and develop. Yeah.
yeah, how societies form and develop, and people within that. And then
Hmm.
the 9 stages feels more like this is what people think, this is how the mind kind of develops.
Yeah.
So one
Yeah.
side's like the collective consciousness, one side's the individual kind of consciousness.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
sort of my understanding of it.
So I'll give you a little bit of a sneak peek now. Um, Sneak peek is so spiral dynamics is mainly cultures, or it's originally developed how cultures are formed. But if you develop, but you can still apply it to people, person to person, but that will be the contents of someone's mind, their values and beliefs, right? Now, the structure of their mind. This is why I prefer stages, which I would advise that we talk about next time, because it fuses both of them together into something that's very coherent. Um, but it's also useful to understand ego development theory and spiral dynamics. Now, with ego development theory, right, um, that is, I always say the structure of the mind, right? Now, what does that mean, Aaron? You keep on saying structure. What does that mean? It means how someone thinks, right? This is the key here. Spiral dynamics is what someone thinks. Structure, ego development is how somebody thinks, right? Contents versus structure. So the structure in terms of this is like, how is it their mind forms ideas? How is it that so someone could be green stage values, but have a very opportunistic, which is the stage, by the way, opportunistic, let's say 1.5 in the stages model, but can have a 1.5 structure or an opportunistic structure. What does that look like? It means their values is all about, oh, green and peace and love and authenticity and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of how they operate that, it's in a very opportunistic way. So they won't have the morality of green stage. They'll have the yes, I believe in all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's all about me. I'm the one that dominates here. I'm the one that has this. I'm the one that has that. Right? Does that make sense?
So you're kind of saying you'd have a like a 3D perspective, 4D perspective, but at the same time be in a lower stage in spiral. So you
Yeah,
have a
yeah.
different kind of um a
You can
view,
have a
but
mismatch.
you can have a
Yeah,
mismatch. So you can still be opportunistic, but you can have perhaps a fourth person perspective. You can even understand how other people think and feel very, very
yeah,
well, but
yeah,
still yourself have that shadow aspect, which
yeah, yeah,
trying to take advantage of people, perhaps.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So in that context, that would be more exactly like you said, a shadow aspect, because you can't necessarily, because with stages or for of this person perspectives, that's like it's more leaning towards ego development, right? So that would be more of like a shadow crash going down to 1.5. However, when it comes to spiral dynamics, it would be like, yes, exactly like you said, you can have a fourth person perspective, but then have this little thing that comes up, right? Like it could be in the meta structure of that fourth person perspective, that it could be about like red stage or 1.1.5,
Mm.
right? Um, the most common, like I said, is normally green and red stage together. I don't know why, but it's something like that. Like I said, I think it's the pre and post rational difference. It's that. And it's also pre and post rational difference. And it's the fact that red stage can take advantage of green stage because green stage doesn't have a hierarchy. So it's not able to distinguish threat levels, if that makes sense. You
Yeah.
know, it's some, you've probably seen it because I think you were a bit more active in the green stage communities than I was. In term, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure you were because I was never involved too much in them because I was always with my mentors and then my peers who are also trained under my mentors. Um, but in those scenarios, you can kind of see it a little bit. You know, when someone hasn't done the therapy work, basically.
Yeah, I can definitely say for myself, at least, I've been in the category where I've had a lack of hierarchies for some point in time in
Yep.
terms of content I would consume and things I would look at. And now it's sort of shifted towards more of a actually there's a benefit to having like hierarchies. You can kind of incorporate both. Yeah.
Mm, Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I guess we'll talk about that next time.
Yeah, we'll talk about next
Uh,
time.
yeah,
Thank
we
you
will.
so much for
You're
being on the
very welcome.
podcast, Aaron. Really appreciate your time, and we'll
Thank you,
see you
sir.
next time on the podcast. And for all the viewers out there, make sure to put some comments below. And if you have any questions for Aaron
Mhm.
on any of these topics, write them below, and we will be sure to talk about that next time. Thank you.
Perfect.